ja in der Tat so, dass die Migrantenfrage wohl zurzeit die Klammer ist, die V4, die Visegrád-4-Länder in erster Linie zusammenhält. Denn wenn man sonst sieht, wie in den einzelnen Politikbereichen sich doch unterschiedliche Meinungen auftun, dann ist dieser Block nicht so einheitlich zu sehen. Aber in der Flüchtlingsfrage offensichtlich ist hier eine gemeinsame Linie doch die Basis der Zusammenarbeit, wenn ich das richtig sehe. Aber zunächst noch die polnische Stimme, Herr Konrad Szymanski.
Thank you for invitation here. It's a pleasure to be here together with our colleagues from Visegrád-Gruppe. I already said that we pay enormous and growing attention to the regional cooperation and exchange because we would like to be heard and understood well within the European Union. And of course, naturally, Bavaria, Berlin, those political centers, we would like to be understood first. That's a very good opportunity. Thank you for that invitation, because it is well based in our logic of the political process in Europe as well. It is not incidental that we started our exchange in the morning from Brexit, where we can easily share a very similar position on almost everything what is related to Brexit, not only Brexit itself, but we spent, I think, about 80% of time, according to my estimation, talking about the future of Europe. It is rightly so, because the deal and the agreement on Brexit will show the way for the future of Europe. The Brexit itself says a lot, not only about Great Britain. Europeans usually like to talk about the off-roads of populism in Great Britain, etc., to make ourselves in a little bit better emotional position. Brexit says a lot also about Europe. Brexit showed us EU fragility, showed us our failure in decision-making, because it's really hard to make millions of people, naturally market-oriented society, to that kind of dramatic reaction for the status quo in the European Union. It's also our failure. I share the opinion that we heard during the campaign in Great Britain a lot of ungrounded, not very wise opinions about the EU. But we have to study also our role and our part of responsibility for this kind of decomposition, because the mechanisms behind Brexit are present in many other member states, and we shouldn't be too much optimistic about the future without the proper reform of the Union. The mechanism, I would say, the wave of protectionism inside the EU is present in many other countries, and we have to dismantle this problem, because without it, we risk disintegration of the whole organization. It is a worrying fact from our perspective, because we in Central Europe still believe that Europe is a part of the solution. Europe still contributes to our security and welfare, and we would like to save this organization, because we believe that this is the only way, the only solution for European future to be an important part of the world order. We see how the world is changing, and it is not only positive changes. And we can easily imagine how the world would look like and how we would look like in the world scene without the proper cooperation, without the proper arrangements, both in economic, trade, political, defense issues. We have a common interests, but the mechanism we use needs to be repaired. This is why, apart from the smooth Brexit negotiations, we know where we are, we know what we want. It is obvious that we want to protect our citizens' rights and interests. We want to protect our economy interests, which exist within the limits of a free trade, most ambitious free trade arrangements with UK. We want to protect our interests in terms of security. That's why we want to open the door for UK for cooperation in defense and security. That's obvious. We want to recommend European Union most possible ambitious agreement on future relations. But apart from those things, exit scenario and New Deal, we have to think very intensively about the reform of the Union itself. Otherwise, we risk another disappointment, another day in the morning with another referendum result, which will be another surprise for all of us. There is no excuse to abandon the reform agenda today. Of course, with a Slovak presidency and Bratislava roadmap, we already started the debate because we have a kind of calibration of our political agenda. But we have to do it seriously. We have to select initiatives, but also instruments which could unite us, not divide us even in an even bigger scale. It is an obvious risk today that the future of Europe is a dominant issue in European debates today because this future is not predictable anymore. And it's a rather gloomy fact, it's a rather negative information, but it's a fact. So if you really want to save this organization, you have to pay attention for that, for that context. It's not only the question of communication, but communication matters. I think it's obvious that during the 1990s, maybe a little bit after enlargement, it was quite easy to promise anything because it sounds very good. EU promised a lot. It's high time to revise this attitude. In politics, it's very risky to promise too much, especially when you can't deliver. Because here, it's exactly the time and place where disappointment is born and grows. The disappointment, grounded or ungrounded, it doesn't matter, in fact, in democracy. Disappointment is the greatest enemy of this project today. So whatever we want to do, we have to think twice before we will promise anything. We can still promise a lot, but there are things, I would say, the old-fashioned manner, where we promise a little bit too much. Look at the investment policy. Rightly so, we would like to revive investment in some areas of the European Union because the investments are very low. It's not the case of Bavaria, of course. But do we really have instruments which would allow us to deliver the real change in investment? We can help, of course. The EU instruments, the financial instrument for strategic investments could help, that's true. But it can't be a substitute for the structural reforms which are at the hands of the national governments of some member states, which would like to avoid this rather problematic operation, not quite supported by the public opinion. So I would recommend to abstain from too ambitious declaration in that field, because it is a kind of moral hazard where we see a lot of politicians who would like to say, you know, I will do my best, but I would prefer to wait for Europe to substitute my lack of ability to deliver a real structural reforms which are unavoidable in many, many European countries. I would like to repeat, it is not the case of Bavaria, it's not the case of Poland, it is not the case of Hungary, it is not the case of Czech Republic, it is not the case of Slovak Republic. No, I'm talking about quite different regions of Europe where this kind of problems occurs. So when we talk about reform, we have to touch the question of the legitimization of the decision-making. The experiment with the institutions we have didn't provide the right answers. People feel unrepresented in European decision-making, and we have to do something with this. Otherwise, people will feel unrepresented, but that's the smaller problem. People will feel not influential enough. It means that the feeling of co-ownership, of co-responsibility for that project will be absent. We'll have a growing number of politicians, not only people, who wouldn't feel that they are responsible for the future of this project because they don't feel any kind of influence over this project. We have to restore it. Of course, it leads to the stage where our ambitions has to be limited. It's true. But it doesn't mean that we can't do it, because otherwise we risk a deadlocks of false or undeliverable promises. It doesn't mean that I would recommend the situation where when we make a passive exercise with a lowest possible denominator, where the outcome could be almost zero today, I'm afraid. Of course, sometimes we have to accommodate fears, and the migration policy mentioned by my predecessor is a right example. We could accommodate fears and objections and disappointments of the migration policy with the right compromise between internal and external instruments, very efficient external instruments of counteracting the primary causes of migration. The other thing, sometimes this method doesn't work. We can't accommodate every kind of fear because sometimes we face a fears without any rational ground. The other option is, of course, confrontation, or at least serious answers for the questions in the public sphere. And this is an example of the common market. We can't accommodate protectionist sentiment across Europe, but we have to protect common market. Otherwise, with our passive approach, with our neutrality over the debate on the future of common market, we will lose it. Without common market, this organization doesn't exist, because we have to prove for nations, business, and individual people that we represent, as Europe, as a European Union, a real added value. So it's time to think twice before we will make a passive approach to the question of the protectionism within the Union. It is the first time, I think, when we see not only national legislation with the protectionist tendencies. That's obvious, natural. I know the logic behind. Now we live in a time when protectionist sentiments are well situated and well grounded, even within the European Commission. So it's time to act. It's time to reform the political agenda. It's time to rethink our goals, but it's also a time to think about the real reform of the Union.